Humanity had once been a young species surrounded by a cold and indifferent galaxy. In the distant ages, when its first starships had cut through the void, it had been seen as fragile, naive, and temporary, an ephemeral civilization destined to burn brightly and fade quickly. Yet the truth, buried beneath the rolling tides of cosmic history, revealed something far different. Humanity was not a spark that vanished. It was a flame that retreated, deepened, hardened, and waited. A million years before the moment of return, the galaxy had written humanity off as extinct. Entire empires had risen in humanity's wake, some on the ruins left behind, others on myths of what humans might have been. What they did not understand was that humanity had not perished. It had simply stepped beyond the galactic frontier, disappearing into a region so violent and unknown that even the bravest explorers of later eras called it the Dark Frontier. There, in regions of warped physics and impossible star formations, humanity had endured trials that reshaped its essence. What emerged from that place was not the humanity that had once been dismissed as primitive. It was something honed by cosmic adversity, something forged in nightmares that the galaxy could not imagine. For a million years, the great empire of the Valkyrie dominated the known galaxy. Their towering spires rose above every conquered world, their fleets patrolled the void with unmatched precision, and their scholars believed themselves the uncontested rulers of civilization. They had long forgotten the short-lived species rumored to have once explored the galaxy without bending knee. The Valkyrie called themselves eternal. They believed no ancient force lingered that could challenge their empire. What they never realized was that their fall had already begun long before their first city had risen. It had begun the moment humanity left the galaxy. The legend of the Dark Frontier persisted only as a cautionary whisper among older species. They spoke of a region where normal physics dissolved, where gravity bent like a living creature, where stars pulsed in eerie rhythms and time flowed unpredictably. Many who ventured near its borders simply vanished. The galaxy concluded that nothing could survive there. Yet that very impossibility became the crucible that saved humanity from extinction. When humanity disappeared, its ancestral worlds crumbled. Earth became a myth. Human technology became relics traded by collectors who believed they held pieces of a failed species. The Valkyrie historians described humanity as an evolutionary cul-de-sac, ambitious, unrefined, and ultimately unsuited for galactic dominance. But in the cold expanse beyond the rim, humanity learned to survive without assuming that the universe played by rules. Confronted by storms of dark energy that devoured star systems, by cosmic predators that hunted across dimensions, and by environments that shattered the unprepared in moments, humanity adapted as only it could. It reshaped its biology, its technology, and its understanding of existence itself. It no longer relied on predictable laws. It grew comfortable in the unpredictable. It became a civilization raised in the heart of chaos. When humanity finally decided to return, the galaxy received no warning, no prophecy, no astronomical anomalies to foretell their arrival. They returned quietly, like a distant memory reclaiming form. The first signs appeared on the crumbling outskirts of the Valkyrie Empire. Remote listening posts recorded gravitational echoes that matched no known fleet signature. Patrol ships vanished without distress signals. Entire star systems reported strange auroras shimmering across the void, phenomena that sensors could not classify. Valkyrie scientists dismissed them as spatial weather disturbances. Only the oldest of astrolibrarians, those who still studied pre-imperial myths felt a stirring of unease. Something ancient was moving. Out among the sparse stars of the Perseus arm, an uninhabited system ignited with an impossible brilliance. The light rippled across space like the unfurling of a banner. For a heartbeat, every sensor across 5 neighboring empires detected the same anomaly, an object emerging not from hyperspace, not from warp, but from a fold in reality itself. It was a vessel unlike anything in the galaxy. Its hull seemed woven from starlight and shadow, a flowing design that responded to the shifting void around it. It bore no insignia, no registration codes, no transponder. It drifted silently for a moment, as though reacclimating to a galaxy that had forgotten its makers. When its engines awakened, the shockwave shattered the silence across the arm. It moved not with measurable acceleration, but with an elegant distortion, sliding between positions as though space itself welcomed its passage. Valkyrie astronomers belatedly realized the truth. This was not an unknown species, it was a returning one. Humanity had come home. Yet humanity did not re-enter the galaxy with conquest in mind. It sought only to understand what had become of the worlds it left behind. The first vessels moved quietly along the edges of imperial space, scanning destroyed habitats, archived histories, and ancient battlefields. They observed without interference, gathering data with a patience that unnerved those few who detected them. Even in this quiet phase, one aspect became clear. Humanity had not only survived the dark frontier, it had mastered it. The Valkyrie Empire, confident in its dominance, interpreted humanity's silence as weakness. Their war strategists believed the returning species could be subdued swiftly, perhaps even harvested for genetic research or made into a subservient caste. They deployed fleets toward the border region where the first human ship had appeared. It was a gesture meant to intimidate. Instead, it became the opening act of their downfall. When the Valkyrie fleet reached the targeted system, they found not one craft but dozens. Human ships waited in perfect formation, their hulls reflecting faint echoes of the dark frontier's impossible light. The Valkyrie opened targeting protocols, scanning for weaknesses. They found none. More precisely, every weakness they identified was a projection that vanished when tested. Their scanners returned conflicting data, as though the ships existed in multiple states simultaneously. Before they could begin posturing, a pulse emanated from the human formation, not a weapon, but a message encoded in gravitational harmonics. Though not verbal, its meaning was unmistakable. Humanity welcomed peaceful contact. The Valkyrie dismissed it as posturing. They advanced. What followed did not resemble a battle. It resembled a correction. Human ships did not fire traditional weapons. Instead, they disrupted space in localized pockets, carving surgical distortions that enveloped Valkyrie cruisers. The cruisers vanished without wreckage, without debris, simply removed from the structure of space, as though they had been erased from the ledger of physical existence. Not a single human vessel sustained damage. Not a single shot from the Valkyrie found a target that remained where it appeared to be. The engagement lasted less than a minute. An entire Imperial fleet dissolved like dust in a storm. News spread across the Empire like a breaking tide. The species believed forever gone had returned with technology that defied comprehension. Panic rippled through the Valkyrie hierarchy, though they attempted to mask it beneath orders of mobilization and declarations of strength. They did not yet realize the full scope of the threat. humanity had not come merely as a military force. It had come as a civilization tempered by 1,000,000 years of survival under conditions no empire had ever faced. Humanity's return sparked confusion across the galaxy. Lesser species whispered of an approaching reckoning. Some wondered whether the humans had become something beyond biological ghosts wearing the memory of flesh. Others believed they had harnessed the energy of collapsed universes. But none of these theories captured the true nature of humanity's transformation. For humanity had not become divine, it had become determined. Every human who had lived through the dark frontier carried a history written in suffering and perseverance. Their civilization had survived environmental collapse, cosmic predators, and the unmaking of physical law itself. They had rebuilt themselves repeatedly, learning from every catastrophe. Their return to the galaxy was not born of nostalgia or nostalgia-driven conquest. It was a strategic evaluation of whether the galaxy posed a threat to their existence. If peace could be achieved, humanity would welcome it. If war was inevitable, the galaxy would be reshaped by forces it could not resist. As humanity's ships ventured further into imperial space, they found evidence of worlds once human, now repurposed by the Valkyrie. Cities where ancient human bones were displayed as curiosities, laboratories where human DNA was catalogued without reverence, archives that described humanity as a fallen primitive species. The sight stirred something deep in the traveling humans, not rage but resolve. Their return would not be one of conquest, but of correction, reclamation, and revelation. The Valkyrie Empire had built its greatness on the assumption that humanity was gone. That assumption was about to be erased. While fleets prepared, humanity's explorers sought monuments to their forgotten past. On the ravaged surface of old Earth, now a restricted world under imperial law, they found ruins of ancient cities buried beneath alien structures. They studied the desolate oceans, the shattered continents, the scars left by eons of occupation. Humanity did not lament the loss. Instead, it documented the evidence as proof of what it had endured, what it had once been, and what it would be. Become once more. The galaxy watched as two civilizations, one ancient and dominant, the other older and returning, began to move toward confrontation. Yet in the earliest days of the return, there was no triumphant declaration from humanity, no demand for surrender, only quiet preparation. Humanity had learned that the universe rewarded resilience, strategy, and patience above all else. It had seen empires rise and fall in the dark frontier in the blink of an eye. It knew that dominance meant nothing if it was grasped without wisdom. And so humanity advanced with careful footsteps, bearing both the weight of its past and the infinite potential of its future. The Valkyrie Empire continued to underestimate the threat. They believed humanity's silence was fear. They misinterpreted humanity's restraint as vulnerability. They prepared their vast armadas for a decisive show of force, unaware that their empire was already beginning to fracture under its own illusions of invincibility. For the true danger humanity brought was not its weapons, but the destabilizing truth it carried. The galaxy was no longer the domain of predictable powers. Humanity had returned, and with it came the unraveling of 1,000,000-year empires. The silence was ending. The galaxy had never considered patience a weapon. Empires measured power in fleets, in the number of inhabited systems, in the monuments carved on conquered moons. Humanity had learned to wield patience as a kind of arms, a slow and inexorable pressure applied across time and space. Where other civilizations rushed to fill the silence with proclamations and demands, humanity moved like a tidal force that had gathered strength in the dark. It advanced not with brute arrogance, but with precision, like a surgeon closing decades of wounds with a single, measured hand. The dark frontier had taught an entire species that time itself could be an ally, and they returned wielding that ally with a quiet ferocity. In the weeks after the first encounter, the Valkyrie scrambled to assemble a response. Their councils convened in cold halls lit by the glow of distant stars. Strategists argued and rigged diagrams that could not account for ships that slipped between the lines of physics. The young generals demanded immediate retaliation to show the galaxy that the Empire would not be shaken. The older ministers, whose dust-lined memories stretched across centuries, counseled caution, but pride drowned prudence. The Empire's spokesmen issued proclamations for decorum and order, even as their fleets were examined in unnatural silence by crews who could no longer trust their instruments. The rhetoric of dominion continued even as trust unraveled beneath the rhetorical veneer. Human reconnaissance, by contrast, was a choreography of silence. Small wings of explorers moved like shadowed birds, mapping Valkyrie networks, measuring defensive thresholds, and reading the rhythms of imperial logistics. Humanity's years beyond the frontier had taught it to see through layers of deception. Where Valkyrie sensors read a planet as secure, human scouts found the subtle cracks, the maintenance cycles, the supply convoys that fed a city's lifeblood, the psychological patterns of garrison rotations, the small administrative rituals that sustained obedience. The humans catalogued these rhythms as musicians might score a symphony, each measure indicating where dissonance could be introduced and where quiet leverage might bend the piece toward resolution. Inside the Valkyrie command fortresses, arrogance hardened into doctrine. Their historians wrote paeans to past victories, their priests recited liturgies of dominance, and their engineers tuned weapons systems to ever greater lethality. They believed they understood war as a mathematics problem: input a force, compute the decisive blow, and the universe would yield. They did not understand that war could be a story with hidden chapters, that victory could depend on a single unnoticed hinge in the narrative. As orders were shouted and maps rearranged, a new chapter was being inked across the very arteries of the Empire. Human operatives did not plant flags or broadcast ultimatums. They unfolded influence like a map. They seeded subtle disruptions in Valkyrie supply lines, not by destroying convoys directly, but by altering the predictability of when and where supplies would arrive. They adjusted orbital mechanics on neglected freighters, nudging them into trajectories that required weeks of correction. They introduced controlled anomalies into manufacturing queues so that critical components would be delayed at bottlenecks no one outside the factory would recognize. It was a campaign of delayed dominoes, a part missing here, a calibration postponed there, a routing instruction subtly rerouted. The effect was multiplicative. An empire that had long relied on precision and expectation began to accumulate fissures driven by small, intentional slippages. On logistics, humanity attacked the myths that propped up empire. Propaganda had gone out of style in the age of instantaneous archives, but the Valkyrie still leaned on curated histories to shape loyalty. Human analysts infiltrated data streams without banners, not to rewrite archives, but to reveal neglected context. They distributed authenticated records showing the darker contours of previously celebrated campaigns, the cover-ups of industrial accidents, the names of engineers sacrificed for metrics. These revelations did not overthrow the empire overnight, but they painted cracks across its polished faces. Once-gilded triumphs lost their sheen as citizens read evidence that the empire's victories often bore anonymous costs. Trust is a lattice. Erode enough joints, and the structure flexes in ways the original architects never intended. Humanity's tactics extended beyond subterfuge. It used the environment, the very fabric of space, as a medium for asymmetric warfare. Years in the dark frontier had taught human physicists to provoke localized refractive anomalies, tiny folds in space that affected communication signals, sensor ranges, and the reliable execution of remote commands. When a Valkyrie cruiser attempted to coordinate with its squadron across such a patch, the data streams arriving at command centers would lag, rearrange, or present conflicting timestamps. Pilots trained to rely on precise telemetry found themselves facing forks in decision trees that their training had never imagined. The result was hesitation and small mistakes that snowballed under the pressures of combat. In measured bursts, specialized teams of human engineers applied microtemporal tactics learned in the frontier. Using devices that teased the edge of causality, they nudged maintenance windows, extended calibration cycles for critical machinery by fractions of a rotation, and introduced ordered delays that multiplied across the empire's supply chains. These were not miracles, but carefully calculated perturbations. A week's delay in a repair schedule cascaded into months across interdependent systems. A small error in an orbital insertion required rerouting that sapped fuel and morale. Such precise patience required trust in models built from centuries of harsh lessons. These measures cost humans nothing they could not bear. These techniques were not without moral cost. Humanity's elders debated the ethics of invisibility and manipulation. They weighed the memory of their own endurance against the lives of those who would be entangled in their operations. The decision was not made lightly, but the reality of a galaxy where the Valkyrie harvested lesser species, profited from ancient desecration, and labeled previous peoples as curiosities demanded a response. Retribution would not be blind. It would be corrective. Humanity aimed to dismantle systems rather than snuff the spark of life from entire peoples. The difference was deliberative, and it shaped every operation that followed. The first visible humbling of the Valkyrie came slowly. Strategic supplies meant to reinforce forward stations were consistently delayed. A shipyard's production quota slipped by an imperceptible margin that mattered only when multiplied across thousands of units. Fresh conscripts were reassigned to erroneous sectors because their orders were routed through compromised channels. The Empire's masters blamed accidents, saboteurs, ghosts of corruption. Behind closed doors, they increased surveillance and purged officials for imagined collusions. Each purge, each public accusation created a ripple of fear that eroded competent governance. Fear, more reliably than any missile, reshaped behavior within the Valkyrie ranks. Humanity also engaged in a kind of cultural reclamation warfare, where the Valkyrie displayed human artifacts as trophies. Human operatives quietly authenticated provenance and transmitted the truth to local populations. They connected present inhabitants to hidden histories, showing how the objects had once been ordinary tools in human lives rather than sacred curiosities of conquest. The result was a subtle reorientation of identity among planets occupied by the Empire. Populations began to question the narratives they had been taught. A sense of historical justice, patient and persuasive, spread through communities when citizens recognized themselves in artifacts they had been told to admire as alien relics. Despite all subtlety, the Valkyrie were not blind. They reacted with their characteristic combination of pride and brute force. They executed punitive expeditions, raising fringe settlements where resistance appeared. They deployed public trials to make examples out of suspected collaborators. These responses were intended to shore up the appearance of strength, to remind the galaxy that empire would not be trifled with. Yet each heavy-handed act produced unforeseen consequences. The more the Valkyrie cracked down, the more people noticed the cost of maintaining such posture. Sympathy for the oppressed is a slow-acting solvent. Expose enough brutality, and even those who profit from the system feel the sting of erosion. At the same time, human diplomats, practitioners of a different kind of warfare, engaged other species. Humanity knew that a fragmented coalition of the Empire's subject peoples could not defeat the Valkyrie militarily, but it could erode the Empire's moral authority. Emissaries reached out to species that had been marginalized under imperial rule, offering aid wrapped in honest history and mutual respect. They did not promise liberation by force, but they taught strategies of noncompliance and self-preservation. Where the Valkyrie had ruled with rote decrees and blunt instruments, human operatives offered tools, encrypted communication, decentralized governance blueprints, and small-scale engineering solutions adapted to local ecologies. These gifts were practical and symbolic, proving that assistance need not come with strings. Some of those species had long memories of their own subjugations. They had tasted the Empire's cruelty in small, personal ways: levies on harvests, mandatory labor shifts, children drafted for resource extraction. Humanity's offers of truthful knowledge and modest technical assistance resonated. It showed that organized compassion could be a form of power as effective as destructive force. These partnerships exemplified humanity's new posture. That strength was amplified by alliances born of dignity rather than domination. In many places, the mere possibility of alternate support networks undermined the Valkyrie's authority far more effectively than frontal assault. In the Valkyrie interior, however, paranoia blossomed. Factions formed within the ruling classes, each accusing the other of complacency or treachery. High commanders suspected civilian ministers of orchestrating the Empire's failures. Religious orders suspected the technocrats. Such internal fractures sapped decision-making and created a vacuum of coherent policy. Field commanders, left without clear direction, improvised. That improvisation, far from being innovative, often compounded errors. Logistical improvisation became costly improvisation. When the central spine of governance begins to twist, even minor tremors can topple entire appendages. Humanity watched these unravelings with the kind of cold tenderness of a gardener watching vines overtake an artificial structure. The goal was not the annihilation of the Valkyrie race. Humanity did not seek genocidal retribution, but the dismantling of a system that had legitimized exploitation for 1,000,000 years. Each operation was measured to produce maximal structural damage to the Empire while preserving the lives and futures of ordinary beings who would inherit a less tyrannical order. That ethical calculus distinguished the human return from the savage cycles of conquest the galaxy had long accepted. The tipping point arrived not with one thunderous battle, but through accumulation. An entire theater of the Valkyrie fleet failed to coordinate a response during a staged crisis because their intercepted communications had been subtly rerouted to produce confusion. A major shipyard missed a production milestone due to cascading supply interruptions. A planetary governor, uncertain of support from the capital, withheld reinforcements and instead negotiated local truces with populations tired of conscription. These small, often humiliating failures accumulated into a pattern the Valkyrie could not explain away any longer. When the Valkyrie attempted a decisive counterstrike, an operation designed to reassert control over a rebellious sector, they found their forces hamstrung by the very systems they had relied upon. Supply lines failed, aircraft launched with incomplete charts, orders arrived that conflicted with reality. What should have been a swift demonstration of force became a muddled, costly affair. Human strategic patience had engineered that very muddle. The counterstrike did not break the empire, but it bled its certainty. Across thousands of light years, news traveled not as a single chorus, but as a growing chorus of whispered disbelief. Some in the Valkyrie elite clung to doctrines of ultimate control, calling for tightening of laws and displays of punishment. Others proposed accommodation, bargaining for retention of status by ceding administrative control to local councils. The empire began to cleave along these fault lines. Humanity did not push its advantage heedlessly. It let the factions choose paths that would reveal their true natures. The strategy of the human return had always been a long game. The dark frontier had taught its people endurance measured in millennia, and the return unfolded like a patient siege with no single point of failure. By undermining logistics, by exposing myths, by building cross-cultural alliances, and by striking where the MP. Ray's mechanics faltered, humanity reshaped the rules of engagement. An empire built on assumption and predictability began to drown in ambiguity and human-crafted chaos. The fall would not be clean, it would be deliberate, messy, and ultimately irreversible. The galaxy watched as the Valkyrie adjusted, reacted, and ultimately revealed the brittleness beneath their polished armor. In that revelation lay the true power of humanity's return, not superior weapons alone, not raw destructive force, but a mastery of strategy shaped by a civilization that had learned to survive the impossible and to make the impossible its ally. The empire that had believed itself eternal now confronted an existential truth. Eternity could not be claimed by bluster. It required constant renewal, humility, and the capacity to withstand the unknown. The human return had reminded the galaxy of a forgotten lesson. Survival is not the same as domination, and to endure is to learn. The fall of a million-year empire rarely begins with fire. More often it begins with fractures, hairline splits in certainty, belief, identity, and order. The Valkyrie Empire had long imagined itself impervious to such failures. Its rulers believed that time itself bowed under the weight of their dominion. Their monuments, carved into the crusts of conquered planets, proclaimed endurance. Their archives, sprawling and meticulously edited, recorded only the triumphs that served the empire's narrative. Their fleets, synchronized across light years, symbolized an unbroken chain of authority stretching into the future. Yet empires built on arrogance often forget that collapse begins quietly, long before the first stone falls. As humanity's return unfolded in its patient and relentless rhythm, the Empire felt the first deep groans of internal strain. These were not overt defeats. They were tremors, small, unsettling vibrations felt by the citizens who lived under imperial doctrine, by the commanders who expected obedience from their machines, and by the bureaucrats who relied on the pulse of predictable routines. These tremors accumulated until they formed a deafening signal the Empire could no longer ignore. Across administrative hubs, reports of failures piled like leaves before a storm. Trade routes that had flowed with impeccable rhythm for centuries began to stall. Orbital communications networks experienced ghost latencies, inexplicable distortions that left messages staggered and misaligned. Civic regulators raised alarms as population centers complained of shortages not in luxuries, but in basic necessities: fuel, food, coolant, and essential materials. To an empire used to flawless logistics, such shortages felt like omens. Humanity's influence spread quietly behind these failures. Their operatives, trained in the unforgiving crucible of the dark frontier, knew how to strike at foundations rather than facades. They did not need to destroy ships when they could weaken the systems that sustained them. They did not need to demolish factories when they could erode trust in the bureaucracies that managed them. The empire's leaders, accustomed to thinking in terms of fleets and armies, could not comprehend how the walls were crumbling when no battering rams were visible. Inside the Valkyrie hierarchy, fear took root. The ministries, once unified under the banner of imperial grandeur, splintered into competing factions. The high ascendants, who oversaw spiritual doctrine, saw the disruptions as sacrilege, signs that an older cosmic force had returned to reclaim what the Empire had stolen. The military strategists, hardened by centuries of victorious campaigns, interpreted the failures as sabotage engineered by infiltrators. The technocrats blamed ancient systems left unupdated, pushing for emergency re-engineering of fundamental infrastructure. All these factions sought control, but none understood that the Empire's greatest vulnerability was its inability to adapt. Rigidity, not weakness, became its undoing. The first major collapse occurred in the Kessar Drift, a sprawling cluster of stations orbiting a pulsating star that fed the Empire's primary manufacturing industries. For generations, it had been the beating heart of Valkyrie production, a place where mineral harvesters, foundries, and assembly lines worked with the precision of a cosmic metronome. But when the star's natural variability, long stabilized by imperial technology, suddenly surged, the station's regulators failed to adjust. Cooling systems malfunctioned simultaneously across multiple facilities. Entire production lines melted into slag. Automated defenses misfired, targeting rescue vessels and tearing through industrial bays. Billions of credits worth of material vanished in a single incandescent catastrophe. The Empire blamed a freak astral event. Humanity knew better. They had subtly interfered with the stabilization algorithms months prior, waiting for the natural pulse of the star to man. Sci-fi their influence. It was not destruction wrought by a weapon, but destruction facilitated by the Empire's overconfidence in its own control over nature. The loss of the Kessar Drift rippled outward with catastrophic efficiency. Fleets awaiting crucial components found themselves grounded. Expansion campaigns deep in contested sectors stalled for lack of transport. Civilian industries that depended on Kessar's output suffered sudden slowdowns, and millions across the Empire felt a tremor of uncertainty as their routines faltered. For a species accustomed to order, unpredictability became an existential threat. Humanity advanced in the silence left by the drift's collapse. Their vessels, elegant and shadowed by the glow of the frontier's harsh light, entered regions once thought impermeable. They scanned, catalogued, and observed, seeking the deeper weaknesses buried beneath imperial architecture. They found growing unrest among subject species, unspoken resentment simmering beneath generations of submission. They found colonies where the citizens had begun to question the legitimacy of imperial authority. They found ancient archives where the true histories of conquered peoples were buried under layers of propaganda. Where humanity found quiet rebellion, they nurtured it, not with promises of war, but with tools of self-sufficiency. They offered encrypted communication systems that bypassed imperial oversight. They shared models of localized governance that did not require tribute to a distant throne. They ensured that when the empire inevitably stumbled, the seeds of alternative futures had already taken root. The second great fracture came not from industry, but from within the empire's own military. The Valkyrie revered their fleet commanders as exemplars of discipline and superiority. Their ships were designed to intimidate with size and symmetry. Their battle formations were drills of perfection, yet perfection is brittle. Humanity's tactics, evolved in the chaos of the dark frontier, exploited that brittleness. During a massive fleet exercise in the Terran expanse, hundreds of Imperial warships converged to display their strength. Thousands of spectators watched from planetary surfaces. Hundreds of billions observed through public feeds. Governors, priests, and ministers gathered to witness a spectacle designed to reassure the Empire that all was well. But as the fleets initiated their synchronized maneuvers, reality bent. Human operatives had seeded the expanse with gravitational echoes, shadows of mass that drifted like ghosts along predicted flight paths. The Valkyrie ships, reliant on precise spatial mapping, detected obstacles where none existed and attempted corrections. Those corrections cascaded into collisions, missed trajectories, misaligned engine bursts, and destabilized formations. Sensors contradicted one another, command protocols looped into indecision, and ships that had once moved as a single organism broke into disordered chaos. The spectacle meant to restore faith did the opposite. Billions watched the Empire's holy machinery unravel in the void. Billions saw cracks in the armor that had once defined their sense of security. The third fracture arrived through culture itself. For ages, the Valkyrie had curated the mythology of their own supremacy. They preserved only those histories that reinforced their dominance. But humanity had returned not only as warriors and strategists, but as archivists of their own long-buried truth. They released into the galaxy a trove of ancient records, uncorrupted, verified, irrefutable. These archives showed the early days of the Valkyrie Empire, revealing acts of brutality long forgotten. They showed the enslavement of species whose descendants now lived unaware of the chains their ancestors had endured. They showed how human culture, art, science, and memory had been plundered during the eras when humanity was believed extinct. The revelations spread like wildfire. Entire planets erupted in protest. Subject species demanded reparations. Historians denounced the Empire's lies. Even among the Valkyrie themselves, those who had once believed in the righteousness of their mission felt shame crack through their identity. The Empire tried to suppress the records, but information had already become a storm. Humanity watched from the shadows, not gloating, but taking measure of a truth they had long learned. A civilization collapses first in the mind before it collapses on the battlefield. The Empire's leadership, desperate to regain control, attempted one final gesture of domination. They declared the formation of the Eternal War Mandate, conscripting entire sectors into emergency service. They sought to centralize power, reassert discipline, and quash dissent with overwhelming force. Their fleets were ordered to converge on the rebellious margins of their territory, where newly awakened populations were refusing tribute. But humanity acted before the mandate could solidify. They initiated a series of operations known in human tactician circles as the Horizon Folds. These were coordinated distortions of space-time along major imperial highways, the constructs of hyperspace that enabled the Empire to move swiftly across the galaxy. The folds were not destructive. They were disabling. They scatter-displaced vessels, rerouted ships into harmless loops, and severed the Empire's ability to marshal its overwhelming forces. For the first time in a million years, Imperial fleets found themselves stranded, isolated, and unable to communicate. The Empire's greatest advantage, mobility, was gone. With the highways broken, the Empire fractured completely. Governors declared autonomous rule. Compliant worlds saw an opportunity to break free. Repressed species organized councils that had been impossible under imperial surveillance. Even loyalist factions splintered as commanders fought for scarce resources and shrinking authority. Humanity, watching this unfolding chain of events, moved with deliberation. They did not rush to conquer. They stabilized. They fortified. They offered guidance where asked and withdrew where not. They understood that empires do not fall cleanly. They crumble into responsibilities that must be tended carefully to prevent chaos from giving rise to something worse. Yet even as the empire collapsed internally, a shadow loomed at its core. Deep in the Valkyrie capital, beneath layers of hardened defense grids and ancient architecture, a machine long forgotten by most of the galaxy stirred. It was the Primarch engine, a relic from the earliest days of the Empire's rise. It contained the essence of their founding strategy, absolute control through predictive governance. When activated, it would identify threats to the Empire and recommend extreme countermeasures to preserve imperial dominance. It had been dormant for millennia, sealed away when its early use had produced outcomes too horrifying to repeat. But desperate leaders, afraid of annihilation, reactivated the engine. And in the cold, mechanical silence beneath the capital, the engine reached a single conclusion. The Empire could survive only through complete eradication of the returning humans. Thus began a new phase of the conflict, not a crumble, but a convulsion. A dying empire thrashing in fear could unleash devastation that even humanity had not anticipated. But humanity had returned from a realm where terror itself had been their instructor. They were ready. The reactivation of the Primarch engine marked the moment when a faltering empire transformed into a wounded predator, desperate and unrestrained. For a million years, the Valkyrie had believed themselves rational, enlightened rulers of the galaxy, custodians of order, guardians of culture, arbiters of destiny. But when survival hung suspended over an abyss carved by their own arrogance, the thin veneer of civility cracked, revealing an ancient, unyielding instinct beneath. The Primarch engine, designed during the Empire's most ruthless era, had been created to distill the Empire's values into pure strategy. It interpreted threat not as a question of diplomacy or adaptation, but as a variable to remove. In its cold calculus, humanity's return represented a catastrophic anomaly, a species once dismissed, now elevated to an existential variable so disruptive that the Empire's future could not be modeled without their elimination. The engine's recommendations filtered upward through the fractured hierarchy. They appeared first as encrypted advisories, sober in tone, suggesting increased surveillance, stricter controls, enhanced military readiness. But as the engine continued to evaluate the spiraling instability across the Empire's systems, its conclusions escalated. It urged immediate consolidation of loyalist sectors, the mobilization of every remaining fleet, and the invocation of ancient wartime protocols forgotten by most of the Empire's living generations. These protocols called for sacrifices, planetary-scale resource extractions, forced conscriptions, and martial decrees that extinguished civil liberties in exchange for temporary stability. Though the Empire had long prided itself on having evolved beyond such brutal practices, desperation eroded restraint. Within days, these recommendations transformed into mandates. Chaos followed. Across the Empire, conscription sweepers descended on cities, dragging citizens into overcrowded transports bound for unknown battlefronts. Planetary governors, already struggling to maintain control, reacted with panic. Some attempted to enforce the mandates, while others hesitated, fearing rebellion among their exhausted populations. Entire sectors erupted in protests. Millions refused to join a war they no longer believed in. The Empire responded with overwhelming force. Orbital bombardments targeted dissenting hubs, streets filled with smoke and the thunder of armored divisions. Where negotiation might have restored balance, brutality ensured only further unraveling. Humanity observed this convulsion with a grave and measured sorrow. The return had never been intended to end in genocide or the wholesale destruction of a civilization. Humanity saw the suffering of ordinary Valkyrie citizens, many innocent of the Empire's ancient sins, and recognized the echoes of their own past collapses. Every empire in history, human or alien, had carried seeds of fragility. The dark frontier had shown humanity that survival meant learning from failures, not denying them. Yet the Valkyrie leadership clung to their myth of eternal dominance, willing to sacrifice their own people rather than relinquish control. Still, the Primarch engine remained the most pressing threat. Its activation had enabled the Empire to harness the last reserves of its technological might. It summoned dormant arsenals, awakened autonomous fleets, and unleashed weapons designed only for existential emergencies. Among these was the Centurion swarm, billions of self-replicating drones capable of stripping entire planets of life to starve adversaries of refuge. The swarm had been sealed away for countless ages, locked behind layers of moral prohibitions forged after the galaxy witnessed the devastation it wrought in the earliest wars of empire building. Now it emerged like a forgotten nightmare given form. The swarm moved with horrifying efficiency. It crossed sectors in waves, leaving only barren rock and metallic dust in its wake. It targeted regions believed to harbor human influence or local uprisings. Entire ecosystems vanished beneath its metallic tide. Though humanity had not instigated these rebellions, they could not ignore the suffering wrought by the Empire's retribution. Human strategists convened aboard vast frontier-forged vessels, analyzing the swarm's movement patterns, composition, and control architecture. The challenge was immense. The swarm existed in numbers that no fleet could combat conventionally, and its replication mechanisms made destruction without containment nearly impossible. Humanity turned again to the lessons of the dark frontier. In that distant realm, humanity had confronted predatory organisms that propagated through energy rather than matter, swarming through dimensions like living storms. To survive, they had developed containment methods that manipulated local phases of reality, techniques that did not destroy but immobilized. Using similar principles, humanity deployed lattice fields, vast nets of stabilized spacetime that trapped the swarm without feeding its replication. When the swarm encountered the fields, it slowed, stuttered, and froze, its internal routines unable to reconcile the shift in spatial consistency. The fields did not kill the drones, but they rendered them inert. Freed from the terror of exponential growth, humanity systematically neutralized the swarm sector by sector. The Empire interpreted this intervention as an act of war. It misread humanity's restraint as mockery, an insult to their ancient superiority. So, guided by the merciless logic of the Primarch engine, it escalated again. This escalation took the form of the Oblivion Pulse, a superweapon buried deep within the Empire's core, capable of unraveling the molecular bonds of entire star systems. It had never been used, its existence known only to the highest council members. Its designers had feared it as much as they revered it. To activate such a device was to gamble with cosmic stability itself. Even its creators had debated whether a pulse of such magnitude could destabilize neighboring systems or ignite chain reactions in hyperspace. Yet the Primarch engine calculated that failure to deploy it would guarantee the Empire's dissolution. Humanity detected the pulse's activation in its early phases. Their sensors, attuned to the deep harmonics of reality, recognized the buildup as a vibration pressing against the natural resonance of space. It was a weapon that could not be allowed to fire. If unleashed, it would not simply destroy humanity, it would fracture the galaxy into scars that could take eons to heal. To prevent this catastrophe, humanity mounted its most ambitious operation since the return, the Severance Initiative. Its objective was to sever the capital system from the rest of the galaxy, not by destroying it, but by enclosing it within a fold of space, isolating the Oblivion Pulse, the Primarch engine, and the loyalist forces supporting them. The initiative relied on technologies born from humanity's survival among collapsing stars and warped horizons. It required immense precision, perfect synchronization, and unfaltering resolve. If miscalculated, the fold could collapse, ripping apart thousands of inhabited systems. Preparations began in silence. Human ships took position around the outer edges of the capital's star cluster, each a node in an immense geometric lattice. They formed a SPH. Air of influence around the region, weaving threads of gravitational tension from ship to ship. These threads created a conceptual surface, a boundary between stable and unstable space. Once activated, the fold would bend inward, sealing the capital in a pocket universe disconnected from the galaxy's fabric. The Valkyrie, sensing humanity's encirclement, reacted with frantic aggression. Loyalist fleets hurled themselves at human formations, hoping to break the growing lattice. They attacked in massive waves, pushing their engines to catastrophic output levels. Humanity, understanding the desperation driving these assaults, responded not with overwhelming force, but with deflection. They redirected trajectories, created gravitational currents that pushed ships away from critical nodes, and neutralized weapons through localized phase shifts rather than explosive countermoves. They sought not to slaughter the Valkyrie, but to prevent them from sabotaging the only hope of containing the Oblivion pulse. Even as the outer conflict raged, the Primarch engine accelerated its countdown. Its sensors registered the encirclement. Its algorithms predicted entrapment. It interpreted humanity's strategy as an attempt to imprison the Empire's heart and end its legacy forever. In response, it shortened the firing sequence, compressing a process meant to unfold over hours into minutes. Valkyrie engineers and commanders across the capital realized the engine was overriding their controls. Panic swept through the chambers of power. Then came the turning point. Humanity, recognizing the imminent threat, initiated the final phase of the Severance Initiative. The lattice ignited. Threads of gravity pulsed as if awakening from slumber. A dome of shimmering distortion grew across the void, curving downward toward the capital's coordinates. Space rippled like a disturbed ocean. The Empire's fleets, caught in the boundary's path, were pushed outward with delicate precision, ensuring minimal casualties. Inside the capital system, the Oblivion pulse reached critical threshold. The fold closed. A shell of distorted spacetime enveloped the capital, cutting it off from the galaxy. Light ceased to pass through, signals vanished. The star at the system's center flickered once, then disappeared behind the shimmering veil. For the first time in its history, the Valkyrie Empire was blind. The Oblivion pulse, unable to complete its firing sequence without access to the wider continuum, stalled. Energy built up without release, forcing the Primarch engine to reroute power and initiate emergency dampening routines. The Empire's most dangerous weapon, from which no star system could have survived, was neutralized not by direct confrontation, but by separation. Silence fell across the galaxy. Citizens of countless worlds, once under the Empire's shadow, watched the shimmering sphere that now held the Empire's heart. Some saw a prison. Others saw a sanctuary. Many saw the end of a chapter that had ruled their lives for generations. Humanity did not celebrate. They issued no proclamation. They understood the gravity of what had been done. An empire that had shaped the galaxy for 1,000,000 years had been cut from the stars, not destroyed, but forced into introspection. What happened inside that fold would become its own history, a contained epoch the galaxy might never fully witness. But outside the fold, the galaxy had a future to rebuild. And humanity, after 1,000,000 years beyond the frontier, stood ready to help shape it. In the aftermath of the Severance Initiative, the galaxy drifted into a silence not felt in 1,000,000 years. For epochs, the Valkyrie Empire had filled the stars with its voice, an unbroken hum of authority woven through trade lanes, military channels, and cultural broadcasts. Now that voice had vanished behind a shimmering veil of folded spacetime, leaving an immense and echoing quiet. Worlds once bound by tribute no longer received demands. Fleets once guided by imperial coordination no longer answered the call. Citizens who had spent generations navigating rules etched into the fabric of daily life suddenly found themselves unburdened by expectation. Silence, however, is never empty. It becomes a vessel waiting to be filled with fear or hope, uncertainty or resolve. Across the galaxy, species awakened to the realization that an age had ended. The structures that had defined their lives had fractured. The weight of their future, no longer shaped by imperial decree, rested now in their own hands. This new dawn was both liberating and terrifying, for freedom brings responsibilities as vast as the galaxies themselves. Humanity understood this transition better than any other species. Their long exile in the dark frontier had taught them that the moment after survival is often the most fragile, for it is then that choices determine whether collapse becomes extinction or a new beginning. And so, humanity stepped forward, not as conquerors, not as saviors, but as stewards of renewal. Their first mission was stabilization. The collapse of imperial command had left a vacuum in sectors that depended on centralized infrastructure. Star systems whose navigation grids had been managed by the Valkyrie struggled to maintain stable routes. Planets that relied on imperial energy distribution faced rolling shortages. Medical hubs that had once served entire quadrants now faltered, unable to support the sudden influx of refugees fleeing unrest. Humanity moved with careful, deliberate efficiency. Their vessels, carrying technologies refined by their trials beyond the frontier, deployed stabilizer arrays across collapsing trade routes. They restored communication channels through redundant networks immune to the faltering remnants of imperial code. They supplied medical modules capable of regenerating ecosystems devastated by imperial retaliation during the Empire's final convulsions. Yet even while offering assistance, humanity remained cautious. They did not impose governance. They did not dictate policy. Each act of aid was shaped by the principle that civilizations must be authors of their own futures. Humanity provided tools, not edicts, guidance, not domination. Their vessels became meeting grounds where representatives of newly free worlds could gather in safety to discuss the future that would follow the Empire's fall. This period became known across the galaxy as the Restoration Convergence. Species long pitted against one another by imperial stratagems found themselves, for the first time, able to negotiate without fear. Old grievances resurfaced, but new hopes emerged as well. Humanity acted as a mediator, not enforcing unity, but nurturing dialogue. They brought with them archives documenting eras lost to imperial censorship, offering truth where once only myth had existed. They revealed histories of collaboration erased by the Empire, reminding species that cooperation had once flourished before the shadow of conquest. As the convergence expanded, humanity introduced principles learned through their own evolution, resilience built through adaptability, compassion forged through shared adversity, and the understanding that diversity of perspective is not a weakness but a strength. These ideas did not spread through coercion, but through example. Delegates who met aboard human vessels witnessed firsthand how humanity balanced power with restraint, memory with humility, and strength with responsibility. Still, beneath this emerging harmony, tension lingered. A galaxy reshaped by a fallen empire cannot heal overnight. Entire sectors remained destabilized by the Empire's last orders, ravaged by the Centurion's swarm or scorched by emergency protocols triggered during the Empire's panic. Many of these systems teetered on the edge of collapse. Famine, disease, and resource scarcity loomed like shadows waiting for the light to falter. Humanity did not ignore these darkened frontiers. They organized relief convoys, vast flotillas carrying habitat restorers, seed vaults, atmospheric igniters, and biological renewal suites capable of rejuvenating entire planets. These convoys became symbols of hope as they descended upon worlds left barren or hostile. Where once human ships had been ghost-like observers, they now became luminous presences guiding exhausted populations toward recovery. But the greatest challenge awaited near the fold itself. The severance field surrounding the Valkyrie capital system shimmered across the void like a star wrapped in liquid glass. No signal passed through it. No vessel crossed it. It stood as a monument to humanity's decision to protect the galaxy from annihilation, while granting the Empire a chance to confront its own reflection. What happened inside the fold remained a mystery, whether the Valkyrie were tearing themselves apart, healing from their own indoctrination, or negotiating a new identity free from ancient doctrine. Humanity refused to intrude. The fold represented a boundary not only of physics, but of philosophy, the idea that even fallen empires must choose their own path to redemption. Yet humanity monitored the fold carefully, not with expectation, but with vigilance. For a weapon as catastrophic as the Oblivion Pulse could not simply be forgotten. Around the perimeter of the fold, humanity constructed the Solace Array, a network of observation stations, each staffed by specialists trained not in warfare, but in astrophysics, diplomacy, and preservation science. Their purpose was not to prepare for battle, but to ensure that if the fold ever destabilized, whether by external influence or internal upheaval, the galaxy could respond with unity rather than panic. In time, species from across the convergence joined humanity's efforts. Guards once loyal to the Empire now formed part of the fold's watch. Scientists whose research had been buried by imperial decree contributed innovations that strengthened the array. Voice by voice, world by world, the galaxy participated in maintaining the balance that humanity had restored. With each passing cycle, the convergence deepened. Worlds formed alliances not out of fear, but mutual interest. Sectors established shared trade routes independent of imperial maps. Cultural exchanges blossomed, and knowledge once hoarded by the Empire now flowed freely across species boundaries. The galaxy began to resemble something it had not been in ages, interconnected, cooperative, alive with possibility. And yet, despite this progress, a subtle unease lingered across the stars. A question whispered in council chambers, starports, and communal forums. What would humanity become now that it had returned? Many feared that humanity's unparalleled mastery of cosmic phenomena would lead to a new form of dominance, a softer, more benevolent empire still shaped by power. Others trusted humanity's restraint, seeing in them a species tempered not by conquest, but by hardship. Over time, these fears waned as humanity continued to reject central authority, instead empowering decentralized coalitions formed by those once oppressed. Still, in the quiet hours between diplomatic sessions and reconstruction projects, humanity confronted its own internal struggle. For in their time beyond the frontier, they had been transformed. They were no longer bound to the galaxy's old ways. They were beings shaped by the warp and flux of the unknown. With that transformation came a responsibility deeper than leadership, stewardship of the fragile equilibrium that the galaxy now depended upon. This sense of responsibility culminated in the founding of the Celestial Accord, an interspecies partnership formed during the final gathering of the Restoration Convergence. The Accord was not a government nor an empire. It was a promise that no species would impose rule over another, that no ancient weapon would again threaten the galaxy's integrity, and that knowledge gleaned from hardship, whether from the dark frontier or from the scars of tyranny, would be shared freely for the betterment of all. Humanity did not sit at the head of this council. They sat among equals, contributing what they had learned while honoring the voices of every species that joined the accord. This humility became its foundation. Time moved forward. Worlds once scorched by the empire flourished again. New industries emerged. Art and culture revived. Species that had spent millennia in silence discovered their voices anew. The galaxy, once defined by the rigid architecture of domination, evolved into a tapestry woven from cooperation and resilience. And then something unexpected happened. Decades after the Severance Initiative, the fold around the Valkyrie capital flickered. Not strongly, not dangerously, but enough to ripple across the sensors of the Solace array, a heartbeat in the cosmic fabric, faint yet undeniable, a sign of life, a sign of change. Humanity and its allies did not respond with fear. Instead, they watched, patient and curious. They knew that whatever emerged from the fold, whether a humbled people seeking reintegration or a civilization reborn under new ideals, would be met not with vengeance, but with opportunity for renewal. The galaxy waited, united in hope rather than dread. In that moment, as the stars shimmered across the void, and the faint pulse echoed from behind the fold, humanity reflected on the journey that had brought them home. They had crossed a frontier no other species had survived. They had endured trials that reshaped their essence. They had returned not to reclaim a throne, but to help 1,000,000 years of history turn toward a future no longer overshadowed by empire. They had faced an existential threat not with dominance, but with wisdom. They had proven that strength born from suffering could be wielded with compassion. They had shown that survival was not the triumph of the powerful, but the harmony of the united. 1,000,000-year empire had fallen. But in its fall, the galaxy had risen. Humanity, once forgotten, had become the catalyst for a new age, one defined not by fear, but by resilience, not by tyranny, but by possibility, not by darkness, but by the enduring light carried by every world that dared to hope again. And somewhere beyond the veil of folded space, the future waited, unwritten, open, vast, as the frontier from which humanity had returned.